As you know, I'm Layton Kelly. I'm a missionary to the addicted in Ireland. So my focus, my calling is to go and reach people with addiction issues for Jesus Christ. And I do that through a couple of different ways. I run a Friday night program in our church, and I have a residential drug rehab Christian organization called New Hope Residential Centre. Both are local church ministries in my church, which is Lifegate Bible Baptist Church in Tallaght in Dublin. You know, I didn't grow up in church. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I grew up in Dublin, and everybody in Dublin that I would have known has grown up. You're Catholic when you're growing up in the Republic of Ireland, okay? There is no other options. That is it. Every school is owned by the Catholic Church. All the hospitals are St. Mary's. You know, it's just everything's Catholic in Ireland. I grew up in an area of Dublin where I live now called Tallaght. That's a town that's about a half an hour from Dublin City, and a place called Jobstown. I don't know why they call it Jobstown, because most people don't have jobs that live there, but that's where I grew up. I love it, and I grew up there. And when I was growing up, my family weren't religious in any way. We were taken to the normal Catholic stuff, like, you know, you get your kids christened and you go to your communion and your confirmation. But certainly there was no thought if we go to church every week or we do anything outside of that. You know, we wouldn't have even went to church at Christmas that I even remember. It just wasn't done. I grew up in a home where my father had left and I didn't have a relationship with him growing up. I had a stepdad years later that I have a really good relationship with now. But growing up, I always felt that I was missing something. And it was that relationship with a father, and I didn't realise until later on how much of an impact that had on me. You know, I always tried to fit in. I always looked up to my uncles and my granddad, and they filled in that hole in my life a little bit. But it's still, I always felt like I was missing out on something. When it was like we were playing football, I didn't have a father that came to watch. When there was stuff going on in school, my mum was there, and my mum's the best. Like, we could all turn up at my mum's house right now and she'd feed every one of us, just so you know. That's the type of Irish mammy she is. She is just super. And she was great. You know, in my home, there was, you know, no drugs, no alcohol growing up. Very little of anything that would be like that. My mum was hard working and she's done her absolute best. For me, just a normal upbringing, normal home, nothing out of the ordinary. When I was about 12 years of age, we moved house and we moved down to a new area of Tallaght. And when I moved down, I'd never heard of Christians. I thought as a Catholic that I was a Christian. Didn't really understand anything else outside of that. And there was a family on the road we moved into, and they had been going to the local Baptist church. I didn't even know there was a Baptist church or what it was, but they were going to a Baptist church. And the Baptist church was having a holiday Bible club over the summer. You know, they said that they invited us along, and they said we're playing football. And I love football, and not soccer. I love football. Okay, just so you know. You know, as kids, this van pulled up. They said, "Do you want to go playing football and doing stuff?" I didn't hear anything about the Bible. Didn't hear anything about going on holiday, the holiday Bible club or anything like that. I just heard football, and I got in the van with these strangers that I'd never met before, and I went off and I was at holiday Bible club, okay? And that was the very first time I actually saw a Bible in real life. I had never ever seen one in my home, in my grandparents' home. I'd never laid eyes on one. You never saw the priest in church, you know, reading the Bible or anything like that, or they ever saw or noticed. You wouldn't have had them in the pews. You heard stories like if you read the Bible, it could turn you insane because the priest had a special anointing on him to understand it, and you kind of stayed away from it. You know, it was one of them things. But this guy got up, and he was a young man in the church, and he got up, and we were all sitting down after doing sports and getting sweets and all that kind of stuff. They brought us in for the message, and he sat us down. And he pulled out his Bible and he preached the gospel to us. And that was the first time I had ever heard that Layton Kelly had a problem with God, that I had sin in my life and I needed forgiveness from God. It was the first time I ever learned about why Jesus went to the cross. Didn't really understand that at all. I heard that he went to the cross and you'd see crucifixes everywhere, but I didn't actually understand what that meant or what that was all about. And that young fella, his name was Kevin Daly. as he brought the message to a close. You've heard this before. It was like Jesus, it was like God was speaking to me. Well, that's the way it felt to me that day as I was sitting down. And he said, want everybody to close your eyes, bow your heads. We all done that. And he said, if you want to know how you can get saved, how you can know you're going to heaven when you die, when I start praying, I want you to walk forward and I'll have somebody show you from the Bible how you can know for sure that you're saved. And as soon as he started praying, I just stood up and I started walking forward. And I went to him and I said, can you show me? Because I didn't want any of the others. I wasn't sure they knew what they were talking about, but he sounded like he knew what he was talking about. He took me into a side room and he sat in the chair next to me and he had a big Bible. It seemed really big at the time. And he put it on my knee and on his knee. And he walked me through the Romans road and he showed me from the Bible how I could know that I can become a Christian. And that day I bowed my head and I asked Jesus to save me, forgive my sin. And I got saved that day. I've been saved ever since. Haven't always lived like it, but I've been saved ever since. And God done a work in my heart. And I remember as a young person, I got loads of gospel leaflets out of church and I went to all the old folks' houses up at the top of my road and I put them through all the letterboxes, all that kind of stuff. I went and I knew I wanted to serve God in some way, so I asked what I could do. And nobody really had a job for me, in the church. They were trying to find stuff for me to do. And I asked if I could come and clean the pastor's office. But I asked if I could go and clean the pastor's office and just be a blessing and help. And I used to go up on a Wednesday before church and I would clean the pastor's office. I would empty the bins. I would wipe stuff down. I would dust the skirting boards or the windowsills, stuff like that. Just doing simple things. You know what was in my heart after I got saved? I wanted to serve. I wanted to serve God. It was just in me. God had just placed it in me. And everything was going well. I bought my first Bible. I remember I saved up 25 Irish punts back in the day before we had the euro. And that was like £1 million at the time. Saved up 25 Irish punts. I went into the bookshop that we had in our church. And there's a lady standing there. She's trying to be all nice. And she's trying to direct me to a Bible that's suitable for me in a sense. Like a study Bible that's for teenagers and stuff like that. And that wasn't for me. I was looking for the biggest, baddest Bible that I could get. I went and I picked one that had Hebrew and Greek in it. The thing was about that size, about that wide. And I spent my 25 Irish punts and got big muscles from carrying my Bible around. And I just loved that thing. And I brought that to church all proud every time I was in church. Wednesday evening, Sunday morning, Sunday night, I done everything the church was doing. Went got baptised by my pastor, David Moore, at the time, in a reservoir up in the Dublin mountains. And let me tell you, when you're getting baptised in a reservoir, it's very cold. So you know that you're serious, when you're getting baptised. And what a blessing that was. And following the Lord in believer's baptism. And I just felt for me it was important at the time to do that. And, God was working in my life. And I'd love to tell you that I went on like that and God blessed and called me into ministry and everything went smooth and all like that. But my life wasn't like that. Although I was saved, I still had massive issues in my life from my father not being there and feeling like I was missing out on something and the what ifs and whys of life. And friends had a big impact on me. And I remember when I went from primary school into secondary school, that summer that I had off, I was palling around with these older friends and I stopped going to church. You start missing on a Wednesday night, then you start missing on a Sunday night, and then you start missing on Sunday morning. I just stopped going. I never went back even one time. And the church would call down, they'd knock on the door and I would hide and I wouldn't come down to the door. I was always missing. And I was embarrassed to talk to them. I knew I was backslidden. I knew I should be in church and I was running from God. The Bible was in the cupboard and there was stuff over so I didn't have to look at it. And I knew I wasn't doing right. And quite quickly my life started to spiral out of control in that I started doing things like stealing cars. That's what my friends were doing at the time. We were joyriding. We'd go out and rob cars and we just fly up and down the roads, pulling handbrake turns up and down the road, driving all over the mountains and all that kind of stuff. When I was a young teenager, got caught in the Dublin mountains in a stolen car. That was the first time I ever got in trouble with the guards. Got my first JLO for that. That's a junior parole officer for those of us that don't know what a JLO is. And life was just going, I was just following the crowd. Why was I following the crowd? Because I was wanting to fit in. Why was I wanting to fit in? Because I felt loved and accepted by the crowd. And I felt like these people understood me. I felt like I was part of something. There's a sense of we all want to be loved and accepted. And in a sense, sometimes we go to counterfeit places to find that love and acceptance. And that's what I was doing. And I went and we started doing things like LSD. So I started taking LSD. Then we started taking ecstasy and smoking cannabis and drinking and all the other things that just start coming along. And what I would say to you is, when I stopped going to church and I start doing the wrong things, I never thought for a minute how far those actions would take me. One of the principles we have in my ministry is small compromises lead to great disasters. We always start off small. We don't start on the big things. We start on the small things. And one of the rules I have in my residential program is there's no smoking. You have to be willing to stop smoking when you come in. Because I know if they can beat that, we have a good chance of them beating the next thing. But if they can't get victory over that, it becomes difficult to stay off the rest. Because oftentimes smoking has been the very first thing somebody has done. It's the first drug that people will sneak around with their friends for. And nicotine is a drug. It's the first drug that they will steal maybe from their parents or their uncle for. It's the first drug that they will go and chip in money together with their friends and sneak around to do it. And in a sense, it's that gateway, thin end of the wedge that gets in. And I think it's important for us to have that rule. And that means that we wouldn't be a fit for everybody. There's a lot of people that phone up and say, listen, I want help. We tell them we have no smoking policy. They're like, oh no, I'm not coming there. I'd have to give up smoking. It doesn't matter how bad my life is, but I don't want to give up smoking. And for me, I was doing everything. I was, went through all the drugs. And I got to the place one Halloween night. I said I'd never ever take heroin because that was seen as a real dirty drug. But when I went to the place, it was Halloween night, so special occasion. One of my friends suggested, why don't we try heroin? We'll just do it once. So we took ecstasy and we got heroin to come down off it. And we went in and we took it. And I'd like to tell you that, it was terrible and it was a terrible mistake and it was a mistake. But you know what? It made me feel amazing that night. People don't do drugs and take stuff because it makes them feel bad. They get something from it. There is pleasure and sin for a season. I didn't want the consequences that would come later with the choices that I made. But taking that painkiller of a drug that night made me feel warm inside. It made me forget the pain that I had. And in a sense, it was exactly what I was looking for, or so I felt at that time. And me and my friends started taking it then a couple of days later, then a couple of days later, then a couple of days later. And ultimately, we ended up, the two of us became heroin addicts. And we said we wouldn't get addicted. We became addicted. We said we would never use needles because that's just the worst, But when you compromise and compromise and compromise, you never know where it's going to lead you to. And the very things at the beginning I said I'd never do, now I'm doing. And I'm addicted. I was on Phyceptone, then I was on methadone. I'm strung out on benzodiazepines, that's Valium and sleeping tablets. I'm on antidepressants, antipsychotics, sleeping tablets. I don't take them to sleep. I take them for a stone. I take sleeping tablets, a month's supply during the day for a buzz, not to go to sleep. My life is in absolute turmoil. I can't get off it. I've tried to stop a million times. My older brother that we shared a bedroom, he's a heroin addict as well. So even when you try to do better, you're living with a heroin addict, and it's the two of us are bad for each other. And the doctor can't help me. My mother's taking me to the doctor. The psychiatrist doesn't help me. He's just giving me medication. And There doesn't seem to be an answer. And I didn't have an answer. And I remember one night being so broken that this has a grip on me and I can't get away. And I just thought, I'm going to be a drug addict for the rest of my life. This is my future. I'm going to be this. And I felt dirty. I felt ashamed. I never thought God was going to be the way out. I grew up Catholic. And when you grow up Catholic, you have to kind of do good works to please God. And I think that was ingrained in me, that I would have to do right before God would ever accept somebody like me back. Right. And that wasn't true at all, but that's the lie I believed. And, none of my friends, we were all drug addicts, we're all heroin addicts. None of us wanted to be that. I left school when I was 13. I done first year in secondary school. And at the age of 13, I left school and never went back. Some of you are thinking right now, I can tell, and that's why I preach very simple messages, just for my brother that said that to me earlier on. I was encouraged. Life was just drugs every single day. Do you ever get stuck in that spiral of every day being the same? You wake up, you're chasing the next thing, you're chasing the next thing, you're chasing the next prescription, Everything's just about how you feed this monster of a habit. Well, that night where I remember crying, banging my hands off my wall, I'm in my bunk bed and I'm just broken and I'm crying out to God, and I'm crying out for God to help me. I didn't think God was going to help me, but I was crying out to God for help. Isn't there something in us all that when we get to that really tough place and we get to that really hard place, there's something in us that knows we should look up? Do you ever notice that? People get to their deathbed or they get real sick. They don't give God a second thought. But when they get sick or this death comes or there's something in the family, what do they start doing? They start exploring there is a God, because we know we're created. And for me, it wasn't too long after that one day I ended up walking through the doors of the church. I had not been there even one time. I wasn't one of these people that was in and out of church and he came back every few years. Not even one time had I been back, but I walked through the doors of the church again. And I don't remember much, but I remember the next day I went back up to see Pastor O'Gorman. And Pastor O'Gorman stood me in front of the mirror in the bathroom and the toilet. And he said, "Layton, what happened to you? How can I help you?" We just read the passage. Our brother just read the passage. And what did Jesus say to Bartimaeus? "What will thou should do? What do you want me to do for you?" Basically is what he said. Pastor O'Gorman asked me that same question. He's like, "What can I do for you?" And I thought if I get out of where I live and have a different place to stay, I'd be away from my brother, I'd be away from my friends, and everything will work out great. And there was some truth in that. It would help. And Pastor O'Gorman took me in to live with him and his family. They took me in, they took a chance on me. They'd never dealt with a drug addict before. They'd never seen one. They'd never talked to one. This was very new for them. When I moved in with the O'Gormans, I was still a raging drug addict. I had needle marks from injecting every day into my arms. I was on methadone. I was able to bring my medication in. They kept it and they would dispense it to me every day. But what they didn't know was I was still buying drugs when I could. I used to be up at the church every day. Pastor would bring me up to the church and he'd put me in the fellowship room in our church. And do you remember the old cassette tape players? Do you remember those? He used to put preaching tapes on and the Bible on tape. And I would have to sit there all day listening to the Bible on tape and preaching tapes. And let me tell you, I thought this is doing me no good at all. This is just wasting my time. What am I actually doing here? Listening to all this Bible stuff and these preaching messages that I'm not even understanding that. But you know what? I think some stuff was sinking in. And although I was struggling and I wasn't clean in any way, I was in a place and around people that knew God and I knew God could change my life even though I didn't believe it. And I remember Pastor taking me to my GP, and my GP has been my doctor since I was a baby, okay? And he has all their certificates all around his office. And Pastor took me in, the two of us are sitting there, and Pastor says to the doctor, "So how do we get Layton off the drugs so he can be off everything and be clean?" And the doctor says, "Well, Layton just needs to reduce on his methadone and get the 30 mils, and then he'd be able to live a normal life. Nobody will ever know, and he'd be back to normal and everything's great." And Pastor said, "But that's not true. He can get off drugs." "Oh, no, we just get them stable. We get them so they're on a low amount so it doesn't affect them, and that's the way it will be." And you know what? You could tell Pastor knew who God was, and he knew God could change this young drug addict's life if this young drug addict would just follow Jesus and do what God would have him to do. Ultimately, Pastor realised that he needed a little bit more specialist help, so he sent me across to this Christian program in Scotland where I done a long-term residential program on a farm in Scotland in a place called The Haven. And in that program, it wasn't the program that changed me. The program gave me an opportunity to come away from where I was, to get away from the friends, get away from the people, to get off the drugs because I had to be clean to go in. But it also gave me a place to find myself again, if that makes sense. I hadn't been off drugs since I was a very young teenager. And emotionally, when you start taking drugs, you kind of stop developing at that point. So when you get off drugs, you're really emotionally stunned. So I had to learn to grow up. I'd never had a job before. I had to learn a work ethic. I got in my Bible. I was in church. I was in services. I was in Bible studies. And I built this relationship with God, and God changed my life in that place. I've never taken drugs since. Never went back in the smoke since. God was able to really change my life. That's when I finished the program. I joined a local Baptist church and went to college. Met my wife in church. That's a good place to meet your wife, by the way. Met my wife in church. It was the pastor's daughter. We got married in 2003. We've been married ever since, okay? And we have 5 boys, all Irish names. Now, it's a secret, so I'm going to tell you, but I trust that you're not going to tell anybody. My wife was actually English. And her dad's a pastor, so he moved up to Scotland to take a church in Scotland. So they grew up Scottish, but she's actually born in England. And me being Irish, I'm worried about that. We named all our kids Irish names, okay? Connor, Oisin, Aidan, Sean and Lorcan. And so the boys weren't confused in any way. But my wife was actually born in England, Yorkshire, I think her dad's from. But me and Claire married, no plans on leaving Scotland, bought a house. I'm working there. She's finishing a PhD in potato diseases and everything's going good. We're serving in church and all that kind of stuff. And then God called us to be missionaries over in Ireland at a missions conference that we had gone to on our holiday. And this morning you learned about all that has gone on. But let me tell you, God had a plan when he encouraged Pastor Gorman to take me into his house that time to be a help to me.